And one of the things that I believe the Lord wants us to be reminded of is that we are in constant need of revival. In other words, we don't just have revival or need revival one time a year or twice a year or have a special meeting, but we're in constant need of revival. Every day we need a new work of God going on in our hearts and in our lives. We can't live on yesterday's blessings. We must seek out the blessings of the Lord today, this day. Therefore, if we will do that, we will stay renewed and empowered and continue to walk in the grace and knowledge of the Lord and to accomplish great things for the kingdom of God. But if we fail to understand that we need revival each and every day, and we get into our minds that we just have revival some days and seek the Lord at certain times, then we're going to fall into a trap. And that trap has been laid throughout the years, to where you have a great day or a great victory, a great experience spiritually, and to be on that mountaintop experience only for that to be followed by falling into a pit or going into a lowly valley. That's true throughout biblical history, that if you're not careful, when you're on that mountaintop, following that mountaintop can be a valley, because you fail to realize that you have to have constant renewal and constant revival in your relationship with the living God. Let me just give you a few biblical illustrations to show you that, and you can look it up when you get home. Everybody knows Noah. Noah, that great and righteous man, who was the most righteous man on the face of the earth. As a matter of fact, is the only reason that we're here today is because there was Noah. Because when God saw the wickedness in this world in which He created, He was set His mind to destroy the world. But there was a righteous man named Noah. And because of his righteousness, God allowed the human race and mankind to continue on. And His plan for that was that He instructed Noah to build an ark. For 120 years, he worked on that ark, and he preached righteousness to the people that watched and saw what he was doing. At the end of that 120 years, the flood came. And when the flood came, Noah and his family entered into the ark along with the animals. And they went through the time of the flood and those experiences of the flood. And then finally there's a time when the flood rescinds and it's time for them to come back out. I would say that that's probably one of the pinnacle experiences of human life, and I would say that was a great victory in the life of Noah, to be such a righteous man that God chose you to preserve mankind and to continue on in this world. It was a great victory. But when Noah gets out of the boat, if you'll read on, you find out that Noah ends up in a drunken stupor. And in that drunken state, he brings shame on himself, and he makes some very difficult things for his family and causes his family, at least one member of his family, to bear a curse on their lives. From being that righteous one who preserved the world to being one in a drunken stupor to make mistakes, that's somebody who forgot you have to constantly be revived and renewed. Or David, the man after God's own heart, that says that when he became king, he won victory after victory, and he never faced defeat. But there was this day when he should have gotten up and gone to battle, for it was for the season for kings to go to battle, that he decided not to go to battle that day, but to stay home. And he walks out on the balcony, and he sees Bathsheba, and he lusts after her and has relationship with her, and she becomes pregnant. And to hide his sin, he kills one of his mighty men, Uriah, her husband, in order to protect himself. Going from one who had enjoyed perpetual victory to a place of committing immoral acts and even murder to hide his sin, that was a man who had great and wonderful days, but he forgot that you have to have in your heart a constant renewing and a constant abiding with God. If not, you can go from the mountaintop to the valley. His son Solomon, the wisest of all men, the man that God chose to build the temple. And when Solomon built that glorious temple for the Lord, the prayer that he prayed revealed the heart of this man. the walk that he had with God, and what power he experienced in his life. And therefore he gained wisdom and wealth and riches and all kinds of things. But after the experience of building that temple and having that glorious victory, then he marries women who serve foreign gods. And he begins to follow after the foreign gods, and his heart and his life are radically changed. From one who built the temple to worshiping false gods. He forgot that he has to be renewed. He has to have constant revival. Or one of my heroes in the Bible is the prophet Elijah. Elijah, that great man of God who stood on Mount Carmel by himself against those prophets of Baal, and there were hundreds of them. And they were having the contest between God Jehovah and God Baal as to who was really God, to prove that to the nation of Israel. And the Baal prophets built their altar and put their sacrifice on it, and they began to call out from God for their God to answer. Remember, the God who answered by fire is the real God. And they cried out for him to come and to answer by fire. And when he did not, they began to cut themselves and they began to weep before him. Elijah even making fun of their antics and their activities and saying, "Where is your God?" The Baal God never shows up, for he is no God. But then Elijah prays a simple prayer after preparing an altar and putting the sacrifice upon it. And not only that, he also gets some water and pours on it because he wants to make sure nobody thinks it's an accident. That his God who answers by fire can burn wet wood as well as dry wood. And therefore he puts water upon it. He prays a simple prayer. God, reveal yourself by sending fire. And the fire comes and consumes up the sacrifice, the altar, sucks up the water. What a great and glorious victory. Not only that, after that, he puts the prophets of Baal to death. After that, he goes and he prays. Remember, it had not rained on the earth for a number of years. And he prays, and the rains come. Boy, you're talking about a glorious day. That's a high watermark, I'd say, for that prophet's life. But then comes chapter 19. The first verse of chapter 19 says, "And Jezebel sent him a message that if you're not dead by this time tomorrow," a threat that he would be dead within 24 hours. And I want my friend, I want my hero in the Old Testament, I want him to stand up and say, "Come on, Jezebel." But he doesn't. He rather has fear in his heart, and he runs from Jezebel and goes into the wilderness and hides himself and begs for God to kill him. Why? Because he forgot. He forgot that you have to be renewed. You have to have constant revival, constant renewal in your walk with God. For if not, you can have a great victory one day and experience defeat the next. And for the New Testament, we know Peter. We love Peter so much. And Peter at Caesarea Philippi makes that glorious confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," when Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" Boy, what a wonderful confession, to the point that Jesus even taken back to saying, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who's in heaven has revealed this to you." Boy, what a wonderful day in the life of Peter to have that statement made by Jesus to him. But just read a few verses down, and Jesus begins to tell his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and he must die. And Peter rebukes him and says, "That's not going to happen." And immediately Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're putting your interest on the things of man rather than the things of God." To go from being "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," to being "Get behind me, Satan," he's a man who forgot that you have to have constant renewal. Constant renewal and a constant walk with God. For see, whenever you have a great victory, when you have a high time in your life and a glorious experience, you can be vulnerable. You can be vulnerable to falling in that pit. One reason you're vulnerable is sometimes when we have great days and great victories, we can be full of pride and we can think we did it. And if we have pride in our heart, then the Lord says that He will humble us as His children. And therefore, if pride creeps up in our life and we've had a great experience with God, because of that pride, we have to go through a humbling and we have to go through a difficult time. Are there times when we're just tired? I think that was the situation with Elijah, just tired in regard to his walk and his journey. Instead of being refreshed by God and strengthened by the Lord, he's just tired. And in that tired state, he finds himself in a valley instead of the mountaintop. Or maybe it's just the fact that we feel like that our work is done and our work is completed. That's what happened to David. Instead of being where he ought to be, doing what he was called to do, he stayed home, leaving the work to somebody else. And in that situation, he fell and faltered and ended up in a valley. Or maybe for some of us, we just do not realize what we've been talking about, that we have to have a constant renewal, a constant reviving in order for us to walk consistently with the Lord. A few weeks ago, we had revival services. I hope and pray and trust that through our prayers and our efforts and through your attendance and through the preacher and the singing and all the experiences we had, I hope and pray that that was a victorious time in your life. I pray that it was a high time in your life. I pray that you had some good experiences, that the Lord spoke to you and the Lord revealed some things to you, and maybe there's a closeness between you and God. But understand this, we cannot live and exist and wait for the next revival service. But rather, we need to be revived each and every day. And if you're not careful, you can have a great time in a revival service, and in a week or so, you can be at a very low point in your spiritual life because you're not understanding you have to have continuous revival instead of those meetings, instead of those events or those times. We have to have continuous revival. Now, I want you to look at this passage that I've shared with you in Judges chapter 15. I want you to look at it because this is an example out of the Bible of someone who understands the need for revival after a great victory. A need for revival after you've had a wonderful, glorious time in victory. Somebody who will teach us something about that. Now, before I share that with you, I'll ask you a question. How many of you remember a time in the Bible when God brought water out of a rock? How many of you remember a time? Tell me somebody. When was the time God brought water out of a rock? Somebody tell me. When was that? Moses, okay, when Moses struck the rock. You remember that? Moses struck the rock and the children of Israel needed water and the water came out of the rock. There's another time when water came out of the rock. When was that time? Another time with Moses. You remember that? It was a time when Moses was supposed to speak to the rock, but he struck the rock instead. You remember that? And whenever he struck the rock, the water came out of the rock, but it cost Moses something. What did it cost him? He didn't get to go in the promised land. Why? Because he struck the rock. He was not to strike the rock. He was supposed to speak to the rock. You say, well, why does that matter? It matters to God. Because the rock in the Old Testament is a picture of Jesus. He is the rock. And what he's simply saying is that Jesus will only be struck once. He will not be struck twice. Jesus will die on that cross one time, not twice. And when Moses struck him the second time, the rock the second time, he messed up the typology. See, the second time you simply talk to the Lord because the price has been paid already. And because he was not obedient, he did not get to go into the promised land. But there's a third time that water comes out of a rock. And that third time is here in Judges chapter 15. In Judges chapter 15, it deals with one of those judges. His name is Samson. How many of you ever heard of Samson? Oh man, we've heard of Samson, haven't we? I mean, Samson is God's Superman, isn't he? This man can do things that no normal man can do. He can accomplish feats that not a normal man could accomplish. I mean, anybody who can pick up the gates of the city and walk away with the gates, that's not a normal man. Have you seen that happen very often? No, he picks them up and he walks off with them. He is God's Superman. Now, let me ask you a question. Have you ever thought about what he looked like? Have you ever thought what he looked like? Now, how many of you ever remember those Sunday afternoon movies that used to come on when I was a kid? Y'all remember those Sunday afternoon movies? They're black and white and everything. But there was always, on those Sunday afternoon movies, there's usually some big, hulking, muscular guy who was doing all kinds of marvelous things. And that was either one of two people. It was either Hercules or who? Or Samson. That's right. Hercules or Samson. And he was big and he was strong and he was doing all these great and glorious things. It was either Hercules or Samson. So we get in our mind that Samson was this big, strong, muscular-looking guy who was God's Superman. Well, I don't think that's what Samson looked like. I think Samson looked kind of like me. What y'all laughing about? What are y'all laughing about? I think he looked a whole lot like me. Not gray-headed, but other than that. About my size, probably. Now you're saying, Brother Mac, that's nuts. Why would you say that? Did you know what he did? You know what he did? Carried away the city gates. Brother Mac, how could you? Okay, let me ask you a question. Think about it just a minute now. If somebody walked into this room who was as big as those doors back there, and he had big hulking muscles, he's bigger and stronger than anybody else, he's got muscles just ripping out everywhere, do you think that people would ask him the question that they always ask of Samson? You remember when they paid money to Delilah to extract the truth from Samson? This is what they asked. Where does your great strength lie? Where does your great strength lie? Well, if he's as big as that wall over there, them doors over there, and he's big, I don't have to ask him where his strength lies. He's bigger and stronger than anybody else. That's where his strength lies. But what if I carried away the gates? What if somebody my size walked away with the city gates? Do you think somebody might ask, where does your great strength lie? And there's another thing about that. You remember, anything that God did, He always made it the impossible situation so that whenever it was done, it wasn't thought as normal, but it was miraculous, so that God got the glory. If a big hulking guy carries it away, he might get a little bit of glory, but somebody like me walk away with the city gates and accomplish the things that he accomplishes, somebody says it's got to be God. It's got to be something else other than them. So God's Superman is Samson. No matter what he looked like, he was a Superman. Well, one of the stories, you find out that he gets married. And whenever he gets married, there's this time that he kills a lion, and inside that lion there's a honeycomb, and he liked to have riddles and stuff, so he created a riddle and he gave it to the Philistines and said, I bet you can't tell me what this riddle is, and they can't figure it out, but they go to his wife and they tell his wife, now you need to find out the answer to that riddle. And remember, she's a Philistine. He always married Philistine women. He was dealing with because God wanted to use them as an opportunity for him to have a relationship with the Philistines, because he was the Superman and the warrior to defeat the Philistines. He was always doing battle with the Philistines. Well, this Philistine woman asked of him and cried and wept and said, tell me that riddle. Tell me about that riddle. You won't tell me. Finally, he tells her. She goes and tells those Philistines that he had the competition with about whether or not they would know it or not, tells them the answer. Now, here was the thing. If they couldn't answer the riddle, they had to give him 30 changes of clothes. If they could answer the riddle, he would go give each of them a change of clothes. Well, whenever they came and answered the riddle, he knew they did not know it, but he knew his wife had told them. So in order to pay them back, he went and killed 30 Philistines, got their clothes, and gave it to them. Whenever he did that, then he came back to get his wife, and the father said, oh, I didn't think you'd want her anymore, and I gave her to your best friend. That'll bless you, won't it? He got mad about that. You know what he did? He caught 300 foxes. That ought to be a challenge. Tied their tails together. I'd like to see that. And puts a torch in between their tails and lets them loose, and they run out in the midst of the fields of the Philistines and burns everything down. Because that happened, the Philistines then got the father and his wife and went and burned them and killed them. And he was mad about that, so he goes and kills a bunch more Philistines. Well, that's where we are in the story. Whenever the Philistines can't deal with Samson, they don't know what to do with him, he goes to Lehi, and the Philistines come to the people of Judah and said, you got to bring him to us. You got to bring him to us. Look at verse 11 of chapter 15. What it says. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you've done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. And they said to him, we've come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not kill me. So they said to him, no, but we will bind you fast and give you into their hands, yet surely we will not kill you. Then they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Okay, get the picture. 3,000 of Judah came down. They said, we've got to turn you in. We've got to tie you up and take you to them. If they don't, the Philistines are going to kill us. He says, all right, I will let you bind me and take me down. You just got to swear to me that you will not kill me. They said, we won't kill you, but we're going to bind you in new ropes. We're going to take you to the Philistines. So get in your mind, they've got Samson bound in these new ropes. He's all tied up, and they're leading him up to the Philistine army that has come and threatened the people of Judah. He's leading them up. They're leading him up to turn him over to the Philistines. Now, what are the Philistines going to do when they get Samson? They're going to kill him. They're going to kill him, or they're going to maim him. They're going to make fun of him. They're tired of dealing with Samson. Look what happens in verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted as they met him. And whenever that shout was raised up, it says, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, so that the ropes that were on his arm were as flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds dropped from his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. So he reached out and took it and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with a jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heap, with a jawbone of a donkey, I have killed 1,000 men. And it came about when he had finished speaking that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he named that place Ramoth Lehi. Okay, he comes up there, he's bound. Whenever they see that he's bound, they shout a shout of victory. We have him. We have him, this man of God. We have him, this one of Israel. Well, whenever the Spirit of God heard that, the Spirit of God came upon him mightily. And when the Spirit of God came upon him mightily, it says that those new ropes were ripped off of him as if it were flax burned with fire. It could not hold him, and he was set free. The next thing he does is the only thing he can find is a jawbone of a donkey. He doesn't have a sword. He doesn't have a spear. He doesn't have a knife. He doesn't have anything. But he finds the jawbone of a donkey. And he takes that jawbone of a donkey and he defeats and kills 1,000 Philistines. Now listen to me. These are not just 1,000 Philistines. These are 1,000 Philistine men. They're not just 1,000 Philistine men. They're 1,000 Philistine soldiers who've been mighty and trained for war. They have come to take him. And Samson, with no instruments except the jawbone of a donkey, takes and kills 1,000 Philistine soldiers at his hand, by his hands. Look around. They're about 1,000, be about 5 times as many we got sitting here right now. Think about 1,000 people, 1,000 soldiers, 1,000 Philistines, and one man is going to kill them with a jawbone of a donkey. How did that happen? Because the Spirit of God was upon him, and he was God's Superman. A great victory. A great and glorious victory. Oh, there were more than 1,000 Philistine soldiers there. The rest of them just took off and ran. They left the premises because this man with a jawbone of a donkey had totally annihilated them. It was a great victory. But what happens next is so very important. Look what happens in verse 18. Then he became very thirsty, and he called to the Lord and said, Thou hast given me this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. A number of things happen in that verse. Look at it as I share it with you. First of all, he lets us know that he realizes he's got a need. He has a need. Do you know what his need is? He's thirsty. I can understand why he's thirsty. Could you imagine taking the jawbone of a donkey and killing 1,000 people? See, whenever you exert energy, whenever you express energy and you use all of that, your bodies need to be replenished of fluids and it needs water. I mean, when you're getting out there and you're working and whatever you're doing and exerting yourself, you become thirsty. And whenever he's exerted himself, he realizes his need, and his need is he needs something to drink. He is thirsty. He says that to God. He acknowledges that to God. He realizes he's got a need. He needs thirst. Have you ever been thirsty? I'm talking about really thirsty. I remember, when I think about thirsty, I think about playing football in Pascagoula, Mississippi. And Pascagoula, Mississippi is right on the coast of Mississippi. It's about 98 degrees in August. That's when we started. About 98 degrees, about 105 humidity. I'm not kidding you. And it was terrible. You just melt in your shoes. And I don't know about you, I played football when it wasn't the thing that we were worried about giving breaks and making sure nobody gets sick. They didn't know anything about that. They hadn't read that book when I was going to football. I mean, the only thing they thought about is if you were able to walk off the field and you didn't die there, then they were okay. Hey, coaches weren't worried about that at all. I remember they didn't have a water break. You got one water break in the middle of about a 2.5-hour practice, and that water cup was about that big. Sometimes you didn't even get water. They just gave you ice, and it better melt in your mouth. First time I understand was whenever you had what was called cotton mouth. You ever had cotton mouth? Cotton mouth's when your tongue is so thick and your mouth so dry, your tongue sticks to the side of your jaw. I know what thirsty is. I remember being, and all you can think about is needing some water. All you can think about is wanting something to drink. That's exactly how he was. He was thirsty. Not only did he realize he had a need, though, he called upon the Lord. He called upon the Lord to meet that need. Look what it says there in verse 18. He called to the Lord and he said a number of things. First of all, he said this, Thou hast given this great deliverance by the hand of thy servant. Very important. Who did he give the credit for in winning that victory? Did he take the credit? No, he says, Thou hast given this great victory by my hand. He remembers that God's the one who gives the victory, not him. Now that's important because I told you that one reason we don't look for renewal, the one reason we don't rely on God, the one reason we won't go back to God is that we get pride in our heart and we think we've accomplished something, and if we got pride in our heart, then we stand away from God and God will have to humble us. Samson didn't say that. Samson said, the victory is yours, you just use me. I used a jawbone of a donkey, and you use me, but all the victory is yours, and I acknowledge that you are the one who gives the victory. That's what he says to God. The second thing he says is this. He says, God, I need for you to meet my need. That's what he said right there. He says, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised. In other words, God, I need for you to give me something to drink. God, I need something to drink. I need to be replenished. I'm thirsty. If I don't have something, I'm going to die. Listen, there wasn't any water there. They were in the rocks. They weren't by fresh water. They were in that place. He'd had to travel some distance to find him some fresh water to be able to drink. And he says, God, I'm not going to be able to make it. I'm not going to be able to survive. God, I need for you to give me something to drink. A third thing he does, though, not only does he give God the glory and tell God what he needs, he expresses his faith in God. God, I'm letting you know that I'm thirsty. And if you don't show up, God, I'm going to fall in the hands of the uncircumcised. But I'm praying to you and I'm asking you because I know you're a God who cares. And I know you're a God who can do anything. And I know you're a God who can do miracles. And you can accomplish all kinds of... And so, God, I am trusting in you. I'm putting my faith in you. I'm not going to try to find it myself. I am asking you. My friend, whenever you stand in need, whatever that need might be, you need to do exactly the same thing. You give God all the glory for whatever he does in your life. You ask Him, you let Him know what your need is, and you express your faith in God. That God who loves you and cares for you will meet that need. That's what Samson did. Well, look what happens in verse number 19. But God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, so that water came out of it. When he drank it, his strength returned, and he revived. God brought forth a miracle. He brought water out of a rock. He brought water out of a rock. Why? So his servant Samson could drink of that water. And Samson got down there and he drank of that water. It says, and his strength was renewed. And it says, and he was revived. You need to circle that word revived. That's one of the few places in the Bible it's used to be revived or to experience revival. He was revived because he had a need, and God met that need miraculously, and he went and he was renewed and strengthened and revived because his needs were met. What did Samson know? That after a great victory, I still need revival. After a great experience with God, I still have a need in my life that God is going to have to show up and meet. And I'm going to let God know whatever that need is. And I'm going to ask Him, and I'm going to believe He'll do that. And God's going to give me whatever I need. And I can be revived. I can be renewed. Look what he says, last part of verse 19. Therefore, he named it, circle this, En-hakkore, which in Lehi is in Lehi to this day. He named that place En-hakkore. Now, if you have a study Bible or a cross-reference Bible, you can look on the index there, and under verse 19, it'll tell you what that word means. It means the spring of him who called. The spring of him who called, or the fountain of him who cried out. You know what Samson, he named that. There is a fountain, there is a spring for those who call out to God. There's a place of refreshment for those who cry out to the Lord. God will move heaven and earth in order to meet the need and refresh the life and revive the spirit of His child. His child who's serving Him and walking with Him and wanting to be used by Him. God will move heaven and earth to provide their strength. All of us need En-hakkores in our life. All of us need to know that God is the God who will answer. Even if it takes a miracle, God will bring forth a miracle to meet that need in our life. Now, the sad thing for me is this, that many times when we have needs, we forget to call out to God. We just won't tell God. We might tell everybody else, but we forget to tell God about our need. And so the first thing we need to do is realize that we need to tell God and acknowledge to God that I got a need in my life, Lord. This is where I face. This is where I am. But the second thing is we need to have faith in a God who meets our needs. You need to understand who you are in relationship to God. You're a child of the King. And that means because you're a child of the King, He will move heaven and earth to meet your need. Why? Because you ask Him. Because you believe in Him. Now, most of us do not believe that. Okay, most of us don't. Matter of fact, when you face things, this is what we'll say. I need to get somebody to pray for me. Now, it's fine to get people to pray for you, but understand this. You have the privilege of asking yourself. God will answer your prayer on the basis of who you are, not because a lot of people ask. He will answer it on the basis of who you are, because you're a child of God. And many times we don't ask that, well, He won't answer my prayer, but I'm going to get somebody else to pray. He will answer your prayers. You are His child. He will meet your needs. If you will come before Him, admit your need, and look to Him as that source, you'll find He is an En-hakkore for you. That He will bring forth a spring and a fountain to meet your need. Why? Because you called out. Because you cried out to the Lord. And Samson, you know, if you read Samson's life, he didn't get a lot of things right. I mean, there are a lot of issues in Samson's life that he needed to get straightened out, and I'm sure he had to give an account of that before God, all right? But this is one thing he did get right. He knew that after a great victory, after a high point, after an awesome experience with God, that he still needed to be revived, that he still had needs in his life that he needed to acknowledge to God. He needed to call out to God. He needed to believe in God to do that. And God would do it. And that's an example for us. That in our lives, no matter what your experience, no matter where you are, you need constant revival, constant renewal. You need to call out and let him bring the fountain to quench your thirst, whatever that thirst might be. And you'll be amazed at what God will do when you know your need, you call out to him, and you believe in him. You believe in him. Not you doing it, not somebody else doing it, but you believe he's going to do it for you. God will answer. So as we pursue revival and as we want renewal and we ask God to do a work, let's not look at some experience. Let's look at the constant, continuous experience of having him renew us every day. Renew us every day. You cannot live on yesterday's blessings. All you've got is today. And you need to take today and live it to the fullest and let him do all he wants to do to revive, renew you, so you don't go from mountaintop to valley, but you go from grace to grace. See, that's the plan of God, is to go from grace to grace to grace as we let him renew us daily.